Hey guys, hello and welcome. I'm your host, Miss Oltola, joined today by Basil, who is everywhere at all times in my business and yours. We have been talking about the Cold War and all of the different conflicts that go along with it, such as the crisis in Berlin, the Korean War, and now the war in Vietnam. We've spent a lot of time talking about things like containment and the domino theory and how the United States is trying to prevent the spread of communism. Well, the war in Vietnam is a little bit different. We do try to prevent a communist leader from taking over, but the war in Vietnam is so special in the sense that it kind of shows the United States trying to use its superior military force and not being successful. The fact that back at home, it's very controversial and a lot of people don't support the Vietnam War. So we're going to kind of work our way through that. We're going to talk a little bit more today about what the war was like in Vietnam, and then we're going to discuss what reactions back at home were when it comes to the war itself. So, moving on. Last week we talked about all of the different bombing missions that the United States would go on. And Operation Rolling Thunder was the name of our bombing campaign over North Vietnam. And we were trying to weaken the enemy's ability to fight. We also wanted to get rid of certain targets, like their military bases, their airfields. We would also get rid of bridges, their roads, their railways, and their power plants. We also had a secondary operation going on, which was Ranch Hand, which was our defoliation program in which we would use chemicals like Agent Orange to try to get rid of millions of acres of jungle. Now, why are we doing this? And it all goes back to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which we talked about last week as well. One of the main targets of Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Ranch Hand was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this trail was that network of paths that connected North Vietnam to South Vietnam. And it was this trail that the North Vietnamese were using to send weapons and soldiers and food to the Viet Cong that were fighting on behalf of Ho Chi Minh down in South Vietnam. Now, the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through lots of thick jungles, and moving around it was really, really difficult unless you were coming from the air. So American planes began spraying those jungle areas with things like Ancient Orange because they wanted to destroy the vegetation. They wanted to expose the enemy's supply routes in their hiding places. Now, we used a bunch of other chemical weapons during this war. We also used things like napalm, which you've probably heard about. Napalm is used to create fire bombs that destroy like farms and forests. We used cluster bombs, which would spray these like super sharp fragments when they exploded. And we also carpet bombed, which is a strategy in which we are dropping like long strings of bombs from very high altitudes. And there's no specific target when you're carpet bombing. You're just trying to destroy large amounts of land. Now, bombing, of course, is what the United States is trying to do before sending in ground troops. So we thought that these communist troops would have their supply routes destroyed. We thought that we would destroy their will to keep fighting. We thought that we would show that we were stronger and we would weaken them by all this bombing. But one of the unintended effects of all of this massive, massive bombing that we were doing was that a lot of South Vietnamese wanted to join the Viet Cong. They were getting fed up with what we were doing over there. And so the United States plan, it was kind of backfiring. Like South Vietnam didn't really like that we were there. And so more and more people from South Vietnam started to join up in the north. Now, the United States strategy, as we talked about last week, was to go in as like heavy-handed as possible. But the North Vietnamese Viet Cong strategy was to use guerrilla warfare. And so American troops were trying to kind of doing this like search and destroy thing through like the thick jungles, but it was really difficult because they hardly ever saw their enemy. So The reason why they were having a hard time finding their enemies was that the Viet Cong had these vast systems of underground tunnels, and some had been built all the way back in the 1940s. And these tunnels are crazy hiding places. And as you can see from this picture, like this is kind of scary. Like trying to fight against an enemy that has a tunnel system like this. But they would use these tunnels as living quarters. They would hide food and weapons here. Sometimes they would pull American soldiers down and strangle them or stab them. And this is what an enemy does when they're fighting against somebody that's a lot stronger than they are. You know, the United States would absolutely blow North Vietnam off the map if we went head to head. So the North Vietnamese are trying to make sure that they don't go head to head with us. Instead, you know, they're fighting this guerrilla sneak war against us because that's the best that they can do. And their goal isn't to beat us into the ground. Their goal is to basically just make the war go on as long as possible and cause us to give up. So the United States tried to kind of smooth things over in South Vietnam, and we wanted to improve rural security. So we started a program known as pacification, and its goal was to quote unquote win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. So we wanted to pacify and calm them, especially in the countryside. Now, this involved a number of things like construction projects. So we were trying to improve the country's economy. We also were moving people out of their villages where Viet Cong were concentrated, and like we were trying to make sure that if we were to attack a Viet Cong camp, that it wouldn't hurt the villagers nearby. And so we relocated those villagers to safe camps and we gave them food and housing. Then Americans went back in and burned the village to prevent the Viet Cong from using it. Now, this seems like, oh, look at the United States being really nice. But you have to realize that a lot of people down in South Vietnam didn't like this. They didn't want to have to leave their homes. They didn't want to see their villages burned down by the Americans. And, you know, the U.S. military leaders are trying to make it seem as though we're doing a really great job down here and we're winning this war in Vietnam and the Vietnamese people love us. But that might actually not be the case. So we are portraying a certain perspective that just isn't true. So most Americans actually supported U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War at first, but as time went on, and as more and more Americans were getting killed in combat, a growing number of people started to question whether or not we actually should be involved in Vietnam. Now, the news had a huge impact on how Americans felt about the Vietnam War. And during previous wars, you know, the military had super tight restrictions on the press. And so people back at home only got to see what the military wanted them to see. But in Vietnam, however, like reporters and television crews were going all over the place throughout South Vietnam, and they were interviewing people and they were videotaping stuff that was going on, and television coverage were showing, you know, these firefights and burning villages. And for this reason, like because of how widely covered the Vietnam War was, we call it a quote unquote living room war, meaning from people's living rooms, they could see everything that was happening in the Vietnam War. And so the government had allowed these TV crews to cover the war, and they were hoping that these television reports would show Americans that the United States was making a bunch of progress. But the reality is that we weren't making progress. And so a lot of Americans saw these television reports as contradictory to what the government was saying. And some reporters actually like questioned and criticized what the government was saying. And they criticized how effective, you know, our military campaigns really were. And so they accused the United States of inflating body counts throughout the war. And that is absolutely something that the United States was doing to try to make it seem as though we were doing a much better job than we actually were. So the Vietnam War was definitely not as it seemed. And as the gap between what the news was showing versus what the government was saying grew, the debate at home also continued to grow as well. And so Johnson was actually criticized by lots of people, both hawks and doves. So doves are people who straight up opposed the war and wanted nothing to do with it. They thought we had no business being over there. And hawks were people that supported the goals of the Vietnam War. But both sides started to criticize Johnson and what was happening over there. So, for example, the Hawks thought that more troops were needed, heavier bombing was necessary to win, and Doves felt as though this was not a fight that we needed to be involved in. They thought that the United States was fighting against the wishes of the majority of the Vietnamese people and that we had no right to, enforce our will upon them. And as this continues to go on, as the war continues to go on, and as media reports continue to show what's really happening over in Vietnam, back at home, we have these two groups kind of fighting with each other about what should happen. And from that, we actually see quite an extreme anti-war movement start to erupt. And a lot of anti-war activity takes place on college campuses where people were holding rallies and debates, and some of the most vocal anti-war groups would go across country. They would spread their messages across these college campuses all over the country, and they would have, these organized debates. They would have organized rallies. They would have organized protests. And Lyndon Johnson, he responded to these protests by insisting that the United States was protecting an ally against an aggressor, meaning he was insisting, no, the United States, we're just protecting South Vietnam against North Vietnam. Now, again, a lot of people believe that the Vietnamese don't really even want us there in the first place. And if you're watching the news reports at the time, it definitely seemed that way. More and more people in South Vietnam were joining the Viet Cong. More and more people were turning against the United States. Pacification was not working. And so these anti-war protesters are telling everybody this. And they are a highly visible group of people. They were all over the news. Lots of people were getting exposed to all of these different opinions about the war, and more Americans started to switch over to being on the anti-war side. All right, so that is where we are going to stop today. You have an assignment that I have posted, and I'm going to give you 2 days to work on it. When we come back, we are going to do a review activity over everything else that we have studied in this unit up until this point. I have about 75 slides that we've gone through, so I want to make sure that we pause and we review all of this before we go on a little bit further. So we still have to finish up the Vietnam War. We have to go into things like the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have lots and lots left in this unit, so stay with me, guys, and get started on your activity, which is actually kind of fun. All right, bye.